Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Unforgetting Iraq. Largely ignored by the media mainstream, Iraq is faced with a number of serious fault lines: growing authoritarianism, corruption, separatism, and political fragmentation. This can hardly be the legacy Washington wanted when it formally ended military occupation. On top of this, Baghdad appears to be crafting its own non-Western foreign policy. To CrossTalk Iraq, I'm joined by Pepe Escobar in Sao Paulo. He is a journalist and author. In London, we have Sami Ramadani. He is a senior lecturer in sociology at London Metropolitan University. And in Jerusalem, we cross to Meir, Javedanfar. He is a Middle East expert. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Pepe Escobar, if I can go to you first. How would you describe Iraq today? Because I noticed something you wrote not too long ago. It's kind of dropped out of mainstream media. It's a story nobody's really interested in. But there are a lot of fault lines, as I mentioned in the introduction.
Yes, absolutely. First, let's put the whole situation into context, Peter. This is the biggest man-made humanitarian disaster of our times, period. Nothing compares to it. It's 1.2 million Iraqis at least dead, killed, directly or indirectly by the invasion and occupation. Over 5 million refugees. There was a cultural cleansing of Iraq as well. Intellectuals were killed. Libraries were looted. Museums were looted. The country was balkanized. It became a gigantic
all right, Pepe, we'll get to all of these topics. We'll get to all of these topics here. Hang on. But why is it out of the media spotlight?
Because it's for America to conduct escape from the brainwashing, in fact, and conduct live soul searching of why this thing happened in Iraq, and has been happening for 20 years, in fact, since the early 90s. It's absolutely unbearable. You have to imagine the effects of the UN-US sanctions during the Clinton administration. You have to study in depth both Gulf wars. You have to study the effects of shock and awe, and why shock and awe was a pseudo strategy concocted to basically destroy and then balkanize
it's very interesting.
To the profit of disaster capitalism. Nobody wants to do this in America anymore.
Well, maybe because nobody wants to talk about Iraq and Syria in the same sentence. Sami, where do you come in on this? What's going on in Iraq right now?
Well, I think I do agree with Pepe's summation of the consequences of the Iraq occupation, US-led occupation. And in fact, it's a common mistake to say that the occupation of Iraq has completely ended. I think the occupation has left a lot of fingers in the Iraqi scene and Iraqi society, and there is still quite a strong, powerful American presence, whether direct or indirect, through some of the Iraqi political forces. The scene in Iraq is quite disastrous. In addition to what Pepe said, Iraq is experiencing a serious internal hemorrhage caused by the occupation, which transformed differences between people, whether these differences are religious, ethnic, sect-type differences that many societies have. But when difference is elevated to animosity and friction and blood, this is what the occupation added to the Iraqi mosaic. It galvanized all the extreme forces, reactionary forces in society in such a way that they have enormously weakened Iraqi society. There is also one thing which is quite important and doesn't hit the news headlines, which is what I call the silent type killings and deaths that occur in Iraq. For example, water sewage gets thrown into the rivers because of lack of electricity. This is causing waterborne diseases. Hundreds of thousands of children are falling victim to quite serious water diseases. The state health service has collapsed. The educational system has almost collapsed with some serious defects. Unemployment is over 50% of the adult population. Part of the occupation supporters' propaganda was to help Iraqi women. Well, Iraqi women don't dare walk the streets at night. So altogether, the occupation is still a living phenomena, despite
let me jump in here. Let's go to
ignoring
Jerusalem.
of it by the media.
Meir, look, a pretty bleak picture there, Meir.
Very bleak.
It is a very bleak picture, and unfortunately what we're seeing now is that Iraq is, after Syria, if not already, it's already becoming an area where the great powers in the region are trying to weaken Iran. I personally don't think it's a great mystery that we're seeing all these Sunni demonstrations in Sunni parts of Iraq these days. Iran's competitors in the region, which are mainly Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf countries, they see Iran's hand is weakening in Syria. They see a link between Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and now they're going after Iran's influence in Iraq. And now we see that there's been recently demonstrations in Sunni areas of Iraq, and according to Human Rights Watch, there's been great abuses of human rights by the Iraqi government against the demonstrators.
None of these things would have happened if the invasion hadn't happened, right? I mean, Iraq was one country before the invasion. Now it's three. Well, it looks that way. It looks that way. Well, I can say it. I could be wrong, but I can say it. Pepe, what do you think about that? Let me go to Pepe then, okay?
Okay, I'd like to add to what both our guests said, which is absolutely correct, by the way. The initial impulse of aftershock and all by the absolutely infamous Coalition Provisional Authority was to pit Sunnis against Shiites. This was the way to balkanize the country. At the same time, ground zero of disaster capitalism. And you have to divide and subdivide the population. So they applied more or less the Lebanese model. So it was Sunnis against Shiites, and Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds, all fighting against each other. And this is what happened. Nowadays, the country, for all practical purposes, formerly Iraq, is totally balkanized. If you go to the mountains in Iraqi Kurdistan, it's another place. It's like the Caucasus already. It has nothing to do with the Mesopotamian plains. If you go to the south, the Shiites live more or less apart from Baghdad inclusive, except the oil industry, which is centered in Basra, which is controlled, of course, by Baghdad, and it's now exporting as much as it was exporting during Saddam. And then you have the Triangle of Death, the Sunni Triangle, Anbar province, west of Baghdad, where we have a simmering, I would say, this is a simmering civil war, in fact, against the Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad, Premier Maliki, which is considered like a new Saddam or a new dictator. There are nuances to that. In many aspects, yes. In some aspects, not at all. But the problem is he has a very good relationship with, I would say, the military dictatorship of the Mulatariat, as I described it in Tehran, and also good relations with Syria and with Hezbollah as well. Don't forget that Maliki spent a lot of his exile years in Damascus, so this is very important. And the Sunni Triangle, some commanders that were part of the war against the Americans in the Sunni Triangle, they crisscrossed the border, because the border between Iraq and Syria in that part there's not a border at all. It's just desert on both sides, and they're all cousins.
Let me go back to Jerusalem.
And some of them are commanders
let me go back to
trying to destabilize the Syrian government.
Can I come in there?
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Sami, jump in. Go ahead. Then we'll go to Jerusalem. Go ahead. Sami, jump in.
Yes, I think there is a bit of oversimplification there regarding Sunni versus Shia and so on. I think this is highly oversimplified. I mean, very few people maybe abroad know that outside of Iraq, that all Iraqi tribes, not a single tribe is not mixed Sunni Shia. So leaders of the tribe are responsible for both Shia and Sunni. Most Iraqi cities have presence of both sects. So to depict the scene as a conflict between Shia and Sunni oversimplifies the situation. There are sectarian political parties that use ethnicity, use sect, use religion to further their nest, if you like. But the communities in Iraq, there is no actual street level animosity between these sects and religions. And this has been a characteristic of Iraq for many hundreds of years, where there isn't a history, there has never been a history of communal conflict. There's been a history of the state, of regimes oppressing this ethnicity, like the Kurdish people oppressing the Shia or
all right,
the
before
Sunni,
we go to,
I
want to go to Jerusalem before we go to the break here. Meir, is Iraq a failed state or becoming a failed state?
I don't think Iraq is a failed state. I think Iraq has many problems, but I don't think it is a failed state. And I just want to point out to your previous point, Peter, you make it sound like that the Sunni Shiite problem in Iraq only came about after the U.S. invasion. As much as I'm against the U.S. invasion, the Sunni Shiite problem in Iraq existed before. Saddam Hussein was killing. Saddam Hussein was massacring Kurds. Saddam Hussein was massacring Shiites. So I think your point of view
But it was
there
a sovereign country.
inaccurate.
It was a sovereign country. That's the difference. That's it.
He was a sovereign country, but he was still killing the different sects within that country. And you're making it sound like that this has only happened after the invasion. And this is something that's been happening for many years.
Okay, Pepe, jump in before we go to the break.
But Saddam Hussein was using Saudi money to invade Iran, which is a Shiite country. Of course he was using
outside forces. Go ahead, Pepe, jump in.
Look, everybody has a very good point in this discussion. In terms of the oversimplification, I agree. In fact, who wants to oversimplify? The Americans. Because as long as they pit Sunnis against Shiites, they have a perfect excuse to be in Baghdad, in that Vatican-sized embassy.
All right, Pepe, let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short break. We're going to go to a short break, gents. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Iraq. Stay with RT. Okay, during the break, Sami, you said you wanted to jump in, so go right ahead.
Yes, I think in trying to specify what the US-led occupation did in Iraq and how it destroyed Iraq, one is not trying to say that Saddam's regime was a bed of roses. Saddam's regime was a dictatorship. It was a dictatorship. It killed many thousands of people. It waged a war of aggression against Iran, etc., etc. But the people, most people in Iraq who were not, say, politically active directly against the regime, at least led a semi-normal life. There was electricity, there was food distribution, children went to the school without being kidnapped. The people's daily lives were not so deadly, and this is what the occupation did to Iraq. So when one describes the consequences of the US-led occupation, one is not justifying Saddam's crimes. One is pointing out that a country like Iraq, a great civilization, has been brought down to its knees by this direct occupation. The brutality of the occupation surpassed Saddam's regime. The tortures in the prisons of Abu Ghraib and other secret prisons surpassed what Saddam's torture chambers did. So one is trying to see where Iraq has traveled following the 13 years of sanctions, following the brutal occupation. And this is what we are trying to resolve in a way as well. What is the future for Iraq having traveled through this bloody carnage? And the United States today is trying to further destabilize Iraq so that it can have a regime in Baghdad that only says yes to what Washington wants. And this is not easy to achieve. That is why Washington, despite Iraq occupying Iraq, is still facing enormous opposition within the country, even within parties that have cooperated with Washington in the past. Because society hates US domination, hated the occupation, hated the sanctions. So there is deep-rooted opposition to US influence. But the United States has not given up. It wants Iraq to be a client, 100% client state. Otherwise, they are promising us that they'll transform Iraq to Syria, where civil war or large-scale fighting occurs within the country. There are terrorist groups already in Iraq. They've been active. The occupation, by the way, brought terrorism to Iraq. There was no terrorism in the country in terms of these extremist takfiri type organizations and so forth.